Hi, and welcome to Wealth Stories for Sleep.
Here, the idea is simple. While you sleep, you grow richer. We gently send messages of abundance straight into your subconscious through calm stories made to gently guide you to sleep.
And while you settle in, if this space already helps you feel a little lighter, tap the like button and follow this channel. Tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from tonight? It's always heartwarming to see this quiet circle forming people from so many places, falling asleep to the same voice, connected by something made to slow us down. You are not alone here. You're part of this quiet little family. And I'm so glad you're here. And as you listen, just remember, these stories weren't created just to help you fall asleep. They speak gently to your subconscious, planting words of wealth, possibility, and quiet prosperity. Come with me. She woke up before the sky remembered how to turn blue. Her feet touched the cold floor like they had for years. With a quiet sigh, she no longer noticed. Her name was Clara, but most people simply called her Mocha, or Senora, or Aquila. La Limpeza. She didn't mind. Maybe she had forgotten how to. She had spent years cleaning places she couldn't afford to stay in. Offices with windows that stretched higher than her dreams once had. Homes where people barely noticed her presence unless she left something slightly out of place. Her hands were cracked, not from weakness, but from repeated care wiping, scrubbing, polishing what was never hers. She had learned to be invisible, efficient, quiet, but not bitter, not quite. Every morning, Clara wrapped her hair, packed a sandwich, and carried two things in her bag: a small notebook with blank pages and a single phrase she once heard on a bus ride home: richness begins where resentment ends. She didn't fully understand it, but it echoed, so she kept it. Every time she cleaned a mirror, she looked into it just long enough to whisper, "There's more than this." And every time she left a place shinier than when she found it, she wrote something in her notebook. Not a to-do list, not complaints, but sentences that felt like seeds. I'm not just a cleaner. I'm clearing space for my own future. Dust doesn't scare me. Some treasures are buried under it. Today, I gave my best. That best belongs to me first. No one saw those pages. They were for her. At night, she read them like prayers, even on days she didn't believe them. Especially on those days. She didn't own much, but in her mind, she began to create something new, a quiet shift, like moving furniture inside a house only she lived in. Her routines stayed the same, but her thoughts didn't. She started observing the homes she cleaned differently. Instead of envy, she studied. What books were on their shelves? What quotes were on their walls? What habits echoed in their spaces? She noticed that wealthy homes often had light, plants, and written reminders framed words like grateful, abundant, worthy. So she wrote them too, not for decoration, but for rewiring. She placed sticky notes in her tiny apartment, the mirror, the fridge, even inside her shoes. Clara, you are not stuck. Clean space, clean energy. Money follows meaning. She still scrubbed tiles, still took the crowded bus, still lived on the edge of enough. But something inside her was shifting. She wasn't waiting for her reality to change to feel wealthy. She was practicing the feeling now. She smiled more, walked taller, and the world, as if noticing her for the first time, began to shift too subtly slowly but surely. One afternoon, as she dusted the bookshelf of a client who never spoke more than a greeting, she found a book titled The Mind as a Magnet. It was worn, underlined, and carried the smell of old thought. She asked if she could borrow it. The woman blinked, surprised, then nodded. Clara read it in 3 nights. Every page underlined something she had already started doing. Without knowing, it had a name: gratitude, intention, visualization, repetition. She didn't need proof anymore. She felt it, not in her bank account, but in her posture, in her language, in her presence. Something inside her was getting cleaner than any floor she had ever scrubbed. And she knew this wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. She just didn't know yet how far it would go. Clara didn't expect miracles. She wasn't chasing luck or waiting for someone to rescue her. But she began to notice small shifts that didn't look like change until they did. A client who usually left without a word began offering tea after her shift. Another asked if she could help reorganize a shelf knot, just clean it. It was the first time someone treated her like a person with a mind, not just hands. She didn't take it as a sign. She took it as a moment, and she honored it. Her confidence didn't explode, expanded, like sunlight crawling slowly across a tiled floor, claiming space gently. She started asking questions, not out loud, but in her thoughts. What would someone who believes in herself do right now? What does wealth feel like in the body? What if I already have everything I need to begin? The answers didn't come quickly, but the questions opened doors in her mind. One evening, she sat in her tiny kitchen, lit only by the orange hum of a street lamp outside, and wrote in her notebook, "I am no longer just cleaning space, I'm preparing. Rooms that I'll one day walk into as a guest, not a worker." The words felt bold, maybe too bold, but she let them stay. Days turned into weeks. She kept reading, kept whispering gratitude into rooms that weren't hers, kept treating herself like someone who mattered, even when the world forgot to. She stopped speaking poorly of money. She stopped saying, "I'm just a cleaner." She stopped apologizing for wanting more. Instead, she started saying things she didn't yet believe, just to see how they sounded in her mouth. "I receive with ease. My time is valuable. Wealth begins with how I treat myself." She started listening to audiobooks on the bus, not to escape her life, but to build a bridge between this version of herself and the one she hadn't met yet. She imagined that version of Clara, often not dressed in gold, not living in luxury, but laughing freely, sleeping deeply, choosing calmly. That Clara became her compass. One day, while cleaning the office of a woman who worked in real estate, Clara overheard a phone call. A property was available, small, damaged, overlooked, but in a growing area. The woman complained it wasn't worth her time. Clara asked gently, after the call ended, what would it take to buy a place like that? The woman raised an eyebrow. Honestly, not much. Just someone with vision and courage. Clara nodded, said thank you, and left. She didn't know it yet, but that was the beginning of everything. She didn't buy the property the next day or the next month, but something had been planted. Not just an idea, but a doorway. And instead of saying, "It's not for me," Clara whispered to herself, "What if it could be?" From that day forward, she walked a little differently, as if something inside her had shifted from asking if to asking how. She still cleaned, still woke up early, still lived in a space too small, But now she carried something larger than circumstance. A belief that wouldn't let her shrink again, and that belief, though invisible, made everything else begin to glow. Clara had never borrowed money before. Not from banks, not from people. She was raised on the belief that debt was danger, that asking was shameful, and that dreaming too far beyond your means was a kind of disrespect. But something inside her had grown louder than those beliefs. Not noisy, not reckless, just steady. She began asking quiet questions to people she once thought were untouchable. How did you get your first opportunity? What would you do if you had to start from zero? What do you know now that you wish you had known then? Most answered kindly. A few didn't. But even the silence taught her something. Then, one afternoon, a woman Clara had worked 4 years ago called out of nowhere. Her husband had passed, and she was downsizing. She remembered Clara's care, how she once rearranged an entire bookshelf just to make the titles easier to find. I know it's small, the woman said, but I have a place for sale. It's old, needs work, but I'd rather sell it to someone I trust than anyone else. Clara visited the apartment the next day. It was worn, dim, cracked tiles, a leaking faucet, but it had a window that faced the sunrise. And something in her heart whispered, this is the one. She didn't have the money, not all of it, but she had saved quietly over the years, little by little, coin by coin, each one like a prayer folded in her wallet. It still wasn't enough. So she did what she had never done before. She asked, first her cousin, then a neighbor, then the woman who offered the place. You believe in work, the woman said. I believe in that. The agreement was simple, flexible, human. Clara cried when she signed the paper, not from fear, but from the weight of an old story finally cracking open. She owned something. Not just the apartment, but the decision, the courage, the shift. She moved in with just her mattress and her notebook. She cleaned the space slowly, lovingly, like planting a garden with her bare hands. She didn't rush to decorate. She wrote affirmations on the walls in pencil. This is not small. This is sacred. I don't need more to feel worthy. Just need to remember. What I touch transforms. Within weeks, the space felt different. Not richer, not newer, just alive. She cooked simple meals with music playing, lit a candle every evening, planted basil in a chipped mug by the window. And one morning, as she looked around, she realized something that stopped her breath. She had already become the version of herself she used to dream of. Not because of the money, but because of how she walked, how she spoke to herself, how she carried presence into the room before anything else. And when people asked how she did it, how she went from cleaning other people's homes to owning her own, she would smile gently and say, I cleaned more than floors. I cleared the space inside me where the old limits used to live. Clara didn't stop working after she bought the apartment. She could have, eventually. But something in her didn't want to walk away from what had shaped her. She just did it differently now. She cleaned with reverence, as if each surface she touched remembered who she had become. Her clients began to notice, not because she said more, but because she radiated something, quiet assurance, not arrogance, not ambition, just calm clarity. One of them asked, did something good happen to you? Clara smiled and said, I happened to myself. She no longer took every job that came her way. She chose the ones that felt aligned. She charged what she felt was fair, not just for the task, but for the energy she brought. Some walked away, others stayed. But now, she didn't shrink to be chosen. She stood where she was and waited for alignment to recognize her. And then, something surprising happened. A young girl in her building, barely 20, asked Clara if she could teach her how to clean like that. Clara didn't understand at first. Like what? The girl hesitated, like you're building something while you do it. That sentence lingered in Clara's mind for days. Like you're building something. She had never thought of her cleaning that way, but maybe that's what she had always done. She agreed. The girl started shadowing her, not just learning about products or motions, but about rhythm, presence, intention. Clara found herself teaching not just tasks, but truths. Clean like you matter, she told her, because the energy you leave behind carries your name, even when no one sees you. Word spread. 1 became 2, then 4, then 6. Young women, older women, even a quiet man who had worked nights for years. They didn't come for cleaning lessons. Not really. They came to be reminded that they were allowed to see their work as sacred. Clara began gathering them once a week. Not a business, just a circle. They talked about dreams, about pricing, about boundaries, about not saying yes just to be polite. Clara didn't have a logo, a name, or a big plan. But she had something rare, embodiment. She lived what she taught. Her old notebook now sat beside a new one filled with phrases from others in the group. I'm not behind. I'm beginning. I charge for the energy I protect. My service is not small, it's a shift. Slowly, they began, working together, referring clients, sharing tools, trading time. One offered to design flyers. Another set up an account to receive payments online. They laughed at the idea of becoming a collective. But one day, someone asked if they were a company. Clara paused, then said softly, "We're a movement. We just clean in the meantime." That evening, back in her little apartment, Clara lit a candle and stood in silence. She wasn't rich by the world's definition, but she felt overflowing. Her cup was no longer cracked, and the more she poured from it, the more it refilled itself, not with money, but with meaning. And that, she was learning, was the richest currency of all. Years later, someone invited Clara to speak, not in a stadium, not on television, but in a quiet room at a local school where a group of girls were learning about money, work, and dreams. She almost said no. She didn't feel like a teacher. But then she remembered the first time she heard someone say a sentence that changed her. Richness begins where resentment ends. If a stranger's words could root something in her heart, maybe hers could do the same. She arrived with nothing but her notebook and her story. She didn't speak loudly. She didn't dramatize. She simply told the truth. How she once believed her value was tied to how small she could make herself. How she thought invisibility was survival. How she learned over time to listen to a different voice inside. And how wealth, for her, didn't start with money. It started the moment she decided to stop thinking like someone who was waiting to be saved. The girls listened, some with open eyes, others with folded arms. But she didn't try to impress them. She just told them what she wished someone had once told her. You are allowed to want more. And you don't need to explain why. When she finished, no one clapped right away. But one girl, maybe 14, walked up and whispered, I didn't know I was allowed to feel proud for helping my mom clean houses. I thought it was something to hide. Clara touched her hand and said, "It's not what you do. It's how you walk into the room while doing it." After that, something settled in Clara, a soft knowing. She no longer felt like someone who had made it. She felt like someone who had remembered herself again and again. One morning, she woke up to find a package at her door. Inside was a handwritten card from one of the women in her group, now running her own cleaning business. Tucked into the envelope was a check for the mentorship I could never afford, but that you gave anyway, it said. Clara didn't cash it right away. She held it for a while, not because she doubted she deserved it, but because she wanted to absorb what it represented. A full circle return. Proof that what we give from a place of abundance always comes back. Not always quickly, not always from the direction we expect, but always. She cashed the check, used it to fix the window in her apartment, the one that faced the sunrise. And every morning she stood there in the light, tea in hand, whispering quietly to herself, "This is wealth. This is wealth. This is wealth. Not the walls, not the number, not the applause, but the peace, the presence, the deep and unshakable." Truth that she had rewritten her story, one thought at a time. And that, quietly, patiently, invisibly, had changed everything. The letter that arrived too early, she never expected anything to arrive that day. It was the kind of day where the minutes blurred into each other, like soft clouds that forget where they begin. She had been folding laundry in silence, her thoughts tangled in the weight of everything unfinished. When the knock came, it didn't sound urgent. It was gentle, like someone remembering an old song. She opened the door to find no one there. Only a single envelope on the doorstep. No return address. Just her name, written in careful cursive, as if by someone who knew her well but hadn't spoken in years. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. It was too light to be important, too old-looking to be recent. She closed the door and sat down slowly. The house creaked around her, like it too was holding its breath. She opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, neatly folded and perfectly preserved. The ink wasn't smudged, but faded slightly at the edges, like time had touched it kindly. The first line read, "This letter is from your future, but not the future you think." She blinked. Not a prank. Not spam. The handwriting was familiar, painfully familiar. It looked like her own. Older, wiser, more patient. The letter went on to describe things she hadn't told anyone, fears buried deep, hopes she had abandoned quietly so they wouldn't be mourned. It spoke of moments that hadn't happened yet, but felt possible, and it carried a calmness that wrapped around her chest like a blanket. "You're going to forget what matters," it said at one point, "and then you'll remember. And that remembering will be your beginning." She didn't know whether to cry or laugh. The letter talked about a rainy Tuesday where she would almost give up. She hadn't reached that day yet. It warned her not to believe the silence when it tries to convince her she's alone. It whispered encouragement in a voice that was hers, but stronger. She kept reading. The letter didn't promise fame or fortune. It didn't tell her everything would be easy, but it did say you will matter in ways you can't yet see. And that was enough to crack something open. She read the last line 3 times before she could breathe again. Just because you haven't arrived doesn't mean you're lost. There was no signature, just a small heart drawn in the bottom corner. She turned the envelope over. Nothing. She placed the letter on the table like it was sacred. Her coffee had gone cold. Her laundry remained unfolded. But her chest felt different, as if someone had straightened a picture frame inside her. That evening, she went for a walk, not to go anywhere, but to let her steps catch up to the truth she'd just read. And as the sky turned to honey, she whispered thank you to no one and to everyone, to herself, to the future, to the letter that had arrived not when expected, but when needed. The letter rested quietly on the old wooden table, as if it had waited centuries to be opened. There was no stamp, no address, just her name written in a careful, patient script. When she opened it, the scent of ink and memory rose like something folded gently inside time. The first line made her pause. You don't know me yet, but one day you'll thank me. Each sentence felt like someone had lived inside her silence. It spoke of nights she would cry without a sound, mornings when lifting her body would feel like lifting a mountain. Still, the letter insisted every hesitant step would lead to steady ground. It told her that her dreams would be mocked by many, including herself, that her ideas would seem too small against the weight of bills, of doubts, of the fast-moving world. But still it urged her to go on. The letter promised she would create something that would change lives even before it changed her own. That every loss was secretly shaping her. Every question she couldn't answer now would become a blessing later. Near the end, it said something no one had ever told her before. I trust you even before you trust yourself. And the letter was signed with a name she didn't yet recognize, her own years older. It felt like time had made a quiet detour to deliver this hope, as if the future had whispered back just in time to stop her from quitting. She placed the letter beneath her pillow, like someone hiding a secret map. That night, she dreamed of a path made of stars and ink. She walked on words she hadn't written yet, down roads that didn't exist but bent with each step of faith. In the dream, she was lighter, taller, as if she had realized that the sky was not a ceiling but a beginning. She woke before dawn, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel the need to rush. She placed her feet on the ground with a quiet thank you, and instead of running into the noise of the day, she sat with a pen in her hand, not to write a reply to that letter, but to write a new one, a letter to another version of herself, maybe younger, maybe more tired, maybe someone on the edge of giving up. And in doing so, the cycle began again. Because when someone believes in themselves before the victory comes, they bend time. The letter that arrived too early was, in truth, the beginning of everything. And now, she too began to write letters that could travel through time toward hearts that didn't yet know they needed to be reached, because silent faith moves fast to wake what the world tries to keep asleep. And anyone who plants words of hope will one day harvest lighter futures, even if the harvest comes from a time not yet born. The man who turned raindrops into paths he never rushed when it rained. While others ran to close windows or cover their heads, he walked slowly, as if the water didn't bother him, as if every drop knew exactly where it was meant to land. People in the village whispered about him. Some said he had lost something in the rain long ago and was still looking for it. Others believed he could hear things the rest of them couldn't, things hidden in the rhythm of falling water. But none of them knew for sure, because he never explained. What they did see, however, was that every time he walked during the rain, something changed. Grass grew where his feet had passed. Flowers bloomed on soil that had been dry the day before. Puddles reflected dreams, not clouds. He carried nothing but a small satchel and a wooden staff, worn smooth by time. When asked where he was going, he'd simply say, "Where the rain takes me," and it always seemed to take him somewhere needed. A farm with tired soil, a school with silent children, a bridge that hadn't been crossed in years. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it was like listening to a song you didn't know you remembered. One day, a boy followed him, quietly, barefoot, letting the water soak into his skin. He was curious, tired of feeling invisible. The man stopped, turned, and smiled without surprise. "Why are you following the rain?" he asked. The boy shrugged, unsure how to answer. The man crouched and traced a line in the mud with his finger. Every raindrop carves its own path, but some choose to carve together. From that day, the boy walked beside him. They never spoke of destination, only of moments. Like when a woman opened her window for the first time in years, just to let the sound of their footsteps in. Or when an old tree, long thought dead, bloomed a single flower as they passed. Word spread. People started leaving small cups by their doors, hoping to catch a drop of his magic. But he didn't stop at houses that waited. He stopped at places forgotten, places too tired to hope. That's where the rain led him. That's where his footsteps meant more. One evening, as the sky turned the color of pewter and the world seemed hushed, he stood still under a willow tree. The boy, now taller, with eyes full of questions, asked, "Do you ever get tired?" The man looked up at the heavy clouds and said, "Only when I try to walk dry." The boy didn't understand then, not fully, but he remembered the words. Years later, he would say them to someone else, someone just beginning to search for meaning in the mess. Because that's what the man had taught him, not with rules or maps, but with quiet consistency. That even in storms, you can move with grace. That some of the most powerful journeys begin when you stop running from the rain. And that maybe, just maybe, the path was never meant to be dry. One night, the rain didn't come. The sky remained still, stretched in shades of quiet gray, and the world beneath it held its breath. The man sat outside his small shelter, listening to a silence so deep it echoed. The boy, now a young man, sat beside him, unsure what the absence meant. "Is the rain angry?" he asked softly. The man shook his head. "No, it's listening. Sometimes even the rain needs to rest." They didn't move for hours, just watched the stillness like it was alive. That night, something changed. When they rose the next morning, the earth beneath them was damped, not flooded, just quietly fed. The boy touched the soil. "It rained while we slept," the man smiled. "Or maybe we dreamed loud enough for the rain to hear." That day, they reached a village on the edge of forgetting. The buildings leaned with fatigue, and the faces they met held more years than hope. Yet, as they stepped through the town, nothing extraordinary happened. No blooms, no puddles of wonder. Just dust and eyes too tired to lift. The boy frowned, expecting something. The man placed a hand on his shoulder. "Not every place wants to bloom. Some just want to be remembered." So they stayed for days. No walking, no wandering, just presence. They helped fix roofs, shared stories, listened, and one morning, as the first light hit the windows, a girl left a cup of water on a doorstep, not expecting magic, just offering. The next day, more cups appeared, some with drawings, others with notes. And the boy realized maybe the rain hadn't stopped, maybe it had entered them, one drop at a time. Years passed, the man's steps slowed, but never stopped. The boy now called the rainwalker, by some continued his journey alone, though never truly alone. Because with every path he walked, every soul he met, he carried those first lessons like seeds in his pocket. That silence can speak, that waiting is a form of courage. And that sometimes, when you give up looking for the path, you become it. Villages began to leave trails of lanterns on stormy nights, hoping he'd pass by. Letters appeared on fences, thanking a man they'd never met, but whose story had reached them like whispers on wind. And in a city of glass and noise, where rain was a nuisance and paths were made of metal, a woman stood still one morning, letting the water soak her. People stared, some laughed, but one child reached for her hand and asked, "Are you waiting for the rainwalker?" She looked down, surprised, then smiled. "No," she whispered, "but I think he's already here." Somewhere, far from crowds, under a sky just beginning to cry, the man stood again by a river, his staff planted in the earth, his face turned toward the clouds. He wasn't waiting, he wasn't seeking, he was simply being. And the rain, gentle as memory, began to fall, not to drench, not to cleanse, but to reveal the path he had always known was there. The one not made of stone or map, but of steps taken with kindness, choices shaped by silence, and the understanding that you don't have to chase the storm to find your purpose. You only have to walk with it, and in doing so, you turn even the softest raindrops into a path no one can erase. The man who kept walking even with nothing and reached where no one imagined. He had no map, no clear plan, no cheering voices behind him saying, "You'll make it." All he had was a child sleeping in his arms, and a bag with 2 shirts, and a book missing pages. People passed him without noticing. The train station floor was cold, and the smell of yesterday's world clung to his coat. He didn't ask for help, not out of pride, but because he had learned that some silences are easier to carry than certain types of pity. Every morning, he wiped his son's face with bottled water and fed him half an apple. The other half he kept for the afternoon. Night, they watched the city lights from the bridge, pretending it was a movie. He said, "Look how bright it is. That's how your heart shines, even if people can't see it yet." No one knew that under the bridge lived a man who still believed in dreams. Not big dreams, not the ones that shout, but small, stubborn, ones like having a door to close or a place where someone says your name with warmth. He had once tried to build a business, twice failed both. Not because he lacked effort, but because life, sometimes, has a way of testing those who carry light. The first time, a flood took his shop. The second, a partner took everything else. After that, people called him unlucky. He preferred to say, he was early, just too early for the success that hadn't learned his name yet. One day, he saw a flyer for a sales training program. It wasn't free, but something in him moved. It's that old flame. He sold the small radio he used to calm his son at night and used the money to enroll. Every day he arrived early, wrote down every word like they were drops of water in a desert. He didn't speak much, but his eyes asked everything. And at night, he'd repeat the lessons to his son like bedtime stories. "You know," he said once, "there's a way to turn rejection into fertilizer. Just let it grow something inside you instead of killing it." The course ended. Most forgot about him. He didn't forget himself. He knocked on dozens of doors. At first, all closed. Then one day, a woman opened hers, listened, and bought. Not because he had the best product, but because he had truth in his voice. After that, others followed. Not fast, but steady. He still slept in shelters, still counted coins. But every step was different now, because for the first time in years, he wasn't walking just to survive. He was walking toward something, toward a name, a place, a chance. And that changed everything. He began to be known by a name again, not just by his story. People started asking for him, not because he shouted the loudest, but because his silence carried something that felt safe. He didn't try to be anyone else. That was his magic. While others decorated their voices with clever words, he told the truth quietly, like someone placing stones to cross a river. His son, now 5, would sit beside him in small meetings, drawing houses with wide windows and suns that never set. He had learned not to interrupt, only to watch. One evening, after a long day, they sat on the same bridge as before. The man looked at the city lights again, but this time they didn't seem far. He turned to the boy and said, "You know, sometimes we have to walk through places where nothing grows, just so we can plant something new after." The boy nodded. He had heard that tone before, the one that came from deep inside. Not long after, an investor who had been watching him for months asked to meet. The man arrived in his old coat, the one that had traveled through winters and losses. He didn't dress to impress. He dressed like someone who had nothing to prove. The investor didn't offer a fortune, just a start, and that was enough, because he didn't need someone to save him. He only needed one hand that wasn't afraid of his calluses. He opened a small shop, then another. Each brick felt like a word he hadn't spoken before. Each sale, a piece of the life he had once buried under failure. His team grew. Slowly, carefully, he taught them the same lessons he once told his son, that you don't need to run to win, that some roots grow best in silence, that dignity isn't a gift, it's something you rebuild with every honest step. He never moved into a mansion. He didn't wear expensive watches, but he bought a bed where his son could sleep safely, a table where they could share bread without counting slices, and a door that closed not out of fear, but peace. When people asked him his secret, he always smiled and said, "I just kept walking, that's all. No formulas, no shortcuts. Just the quiet decision to not stop, even when the world tried to convince him that it was over. Because sometimes the only thing standing between you and the life you dream is one more step, and the courage to take it, even when your hands are empty, especially when they are. Because that's when you learn that your greatest strength is already walking with you." The woman who planted light in other people's windows, and one day, they all lit up in hers. She lived on a street where most windows forgot how to shine. Curtains stayed closed, even when the sun begged to come in. The houses all looked tired, like they had been holding their breath for too long. But every morning, just before the world remembered to wake up, she stepped outside with something in her hand. Sometimes it was a flower, sometimes a candle, sometimes just a soft ribbon tied in a loop. She never explained, never asked, never waited. She simply placed a little offering on the windowsills of the neighbors who had stopped believing. She didn't knock. She didn't expect gratitude, and for a long time, no one seemed to notice. Not really, but she kept doing it, okay? Even on days when her own lights flickered low. Even on days when the wind carried more questions than answers. At night, she'd sit alone in her tiny kitchen, sipping warm tea from a chipped cup, and imagine what it would feel like if someone left light on her windowsill. She never said it out loud, but sometimes she'd write it in the steam of the window. I'm here too. One evening, as she returned from one of her quiet gift rounds, she noticed a soft glow coming from across the street. Then another and another, until her entire block shimmered with gentle golden light. No one spoke of it. No one claimed it. But night after night, the lights stayed. And one day, as she sat by her own window, a child from the building next door ran up and placed a tiny glowing jar on her sill. Inside was a folded piece of paper that read, "You lit us. Now we light you." And for the first time in years, her house felt warm, not just from the outside, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere that remembered that light, once planted with love, always finds a way home. The young man who only wrote letters to his future self, he didn't keep a journal like most people. Instead, every night before bed, he wrote letters long, quiet ones addressed not to friends, not to lovers, but to the version of himself he hadn't met yet. Dear me, 5 years from now. He would begin, followed by stories of what he hoped to become, what he feared to lose, what he secretly believed might one day be possible. He tucked each letter carefully into an old wooden box beneath his bed. He never reread them, never showed them to anyone. He believed that the act of writing was enough to whisper dreams into the fabric of time. On difficult days, when the world outside grew loud with doubt, he'd still write, even if his words were heavy, especially then. Dear me, I know you're tired, but please remember why we began. There were no replies, of course, no magic ink, no return address stamped with answers, only silence. But still, he wrote. Years passed like quiet wind through old trees. He grew. Not in the way people usually notice, not in wealth or recognition, but in depth. His choices became slower, more deliberate. His voice gentler. Something in him trusted the unseen. One morning, while moving to a new home, he opened the wooden box again. The papers had yellowed. The ink had softened. He chose one at random and read, I hope you're reading this from a place you love. I hope you've become the person I believed you could be. And, as he read, he realized something. He was the person he once wrote to. Not perfectly. Not completely. But deeply. He had walked, unknowingly, into his own written future. He smiled, folded the letter back, and this time, he wrote a new one. Dear me, 10 years from now. Thank you for never forgetting us. The man who traded silence for seeds of gold, he was known in the village as the man who listened more. Then he spoke. While others filled the air with plans and prices, He simply nodded, hands in the soil, eyes on the rhythm of the earth. He had no store, no sign, no advertisement. Yet people came, not for good, but to sit in silence beside him. They didn't know why. They just knew it felt lighter when they left. Some brought coins, others brought bread. He never asked. Instead, he handed each visitor a tiny golden seed. "Plant it somewhere quiet," he would say, "and listen." Some laughed, some forgot, but a few took him seriously. They planted the seed in forgotten corners of their garden, or in the cracks between city stones. And slowly, over time, something unusual happened. In the places where the seeds were buried, silence grew, but not an empty silence, a full one. Birds sang softer there. Leaves swayed in a kind of agreement. And when people sat nearby, their minds slowed down enough to hear what they hadn't heard in years. Thoughts they'd buried. Dreams they had abandoned. Answers they had been too busy to notice. The seeds didn't sprout flowers or fruit, but they grew space. Space to hear, space to feel. And in that space, many found clarity. Some quit jobs they hated. Others forgave quietly. Some began again. One evening, a boy returned to the man, holding a piece of paper. "I planted your seed. It didn't grow anything. But I heard my own voice again, and it said, 'Thank you.'" The man took the note, folded it gently, and placed it inside a weathered wooden box filled with hundreds of others, all written by hands that once came empty and left a little more whole. He smiled, looked up at the stars, and whispered, "Gold is not always metal. Sometimes it's what returns to you after a silence well shared." The girl who packed wishes into old shoeboxy had a collection of shoeboxes under her bed, each one filled with things that didn't seem to matter to anyone else. A silver button, a dried dandelion, a feather from a bird she'd never seen. But to her, these were not just objects. They were wishes carefully chosen, lovingly placed, and sealed with a whisper. Every night, before sleep, she would pull one box out, open it slowly, and imagine a world where everything inside had already come true. The silver button became a coin she used in a city made of light. The feather, a ticket to fly beyond the clouds. The dandelion, a doorway to a house filled with laughter. No one taught her this. No one even knew she did it. But she believed that wishes, once treated with care, had a way of growing quietly in the dark. Her room was small, her life simple. She didn't have much, but she had those boxes. And them, she held a version of herself that never doubted. When life outside felt too heavy, she'd just add another item, another whispered dream. And somehow, that tiny ritual kept her afloat. Years passed. She grew up. The shoeboxes stayed under, the bed untouched for a long time. Until one evening, as the world outside trembled with worry, she found herself searching for something she couldn't name. She opened a box, then another, and another. Inside, each wish waited like an old friend. One by one, she realized something. Many of those dreams had found her, quietly, unexpectedly. Not all, but enough to remind her. Imagination wasn't pretending. It was preparing. She sat there, surrounded by old cardboard and soft memory, and began to gather new wishes. Not because she was missing anything, but because she finally remembered how powerful it was to believe with childlike trust. The boxes weren't just containers. They were maps. Two futures written not in certainty, but in hope. And that night, she whispered again, not to wish, but to say thank you. The old man who always paid with stories, instead of money, he never carried coins. Not because he lacked them, but because he believed that the true price of something wasn't always counted in metal. When he walked into the bakery, the florist, or even the tiny bookstall on the corner, he would smile gently, point to what he wanted, and begin with, "Let me tell you a story." At first, people were confused. Some rolled their eyes. Others chuckled, but no one stopped him. There was something in his voice that made time slow down, like rain on a quiet afternoon. His stories weren't loud or grand. They were soft things about a bird who lost its way but found a sky inside a mirror. About a child who whispered to trees and heard them hum back. About a woman who planted letters in the ground and grew poems instead of flowers. Each tale left something behind. A warmth, a question, a pause. The shopkeepers never asked for payment again. Not out of pity, but because they began to feel that what he gave was worth more than what they sold. Over time, the village changed. People started listening more, asking others for their stories too. A boy stopped selling lemonade and began offering one dream for one memory. A girl embroidered quotes into scarves and gave them away freely. One evening, the old man sat beneath a tree at the village center. A young woman approached him, holding a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. "You've paid for this already," she said, "with the story you told last year. The one about the invisible thread that ties people together." He smiled, took the bread, and whispered, "That thread, it's still there." And when he was gone years later, gently, quietly, the village didn't mourn with silence. They mourned with stories. Each person passed one to the next. Some real, some imagined, but all filled with the same quiet wealth he had left behind. And in that, he never really left. Because sometimes the richest people aren't the ones who keep things, but the ones who leave something in everyone they meet. The street vendor who never shouted but always sold out. He had no sign, no bright colors, no clever slogans. Just a small wooden cart at the end of a quiet street, filled with handmade things that didn't look like much at first glance. Woven bracelets with uneven threads, little bottles with folded messages inside, spoons carved from fallen branches. He didn't call out, didn't wave. He simply sat, a soft cloth over his knees, hands busy with something old and sacred. People passed by him for weeks without stopping. In a world of flashing lights and loud voices, he felt invisible. But he stayed. Every morning, he set up his cart with quiet care. He believed that some things only found you when you were ready to see them. And one by one, they came. A woman who had forgotten how to hope. A boy who wanted to give something meaningful but had no money. An old man who just needed to talk. None of them knew why they stopped. They just felt it. When they picked something from his cart, he never told them what it was. He simply said, "Take what speaks to you." It knows where to go, and the strange thing was it always fit. The message in the bottle said exactly what someone had been afraid to hear. The bracelet had the same colors from a dream the girl had as a child. The carved spoon reminded a widow of her late husband's hands. Word spread, but not like rumors, more like whispers that made their way into quiet hearts. One morning, a man arrived early, hoping to buy everything on the cart and resell it at a profit. But the vendor gently smiled and said, "These aren't for those who only see price. They're for those who feel timing." The man left, confused, but somehow lighter. And the vendor, he kept coming back. Every day, even when it rained, even when no one stopped. Because he wasn't there to sell. He was there to remind people of something the world often forgets, that not everything valuable shouts. Some treasures are meant to be found in silence, and when they are, they never leave you the same. The woman who thanked the rain before it fell, she lived in a place where the ground cracked from thirst and the sky stayed the color of old paper. The people spoke of rain like a myth, something that had visited once and forgotten how to return. But every morning she stepped outside, closed her eyes, and whispered, "Thank you for the rain." Neighbors watched, puzzled. There was no cloud, no mist, no breeze, just sun, silence, and her soft voice. Some thought she was pretending, others thought she was mad, but she kept going. She didn't ask for the rain. She thanked it as if it had already come, as if her garden had already bloomed, as if her jar was already full. She swept her porch. She watered dry soil as if it were rich with life. She hung clothes on the line as if they would be kissed by cool wind. And little by little, something strange happened. Her plants, though brittle, didn't die. Her face, though weathered, glowed. And people, though doubtful, began to stop and listen. One child asked, "Why do you thank the sky when it gives you nothing?" She smiled and replied, "Because gratitude makes space for miracles, and space is how rain finds room to fall." That night, the sky remained quiet. But the next morning, before dawn, a soft breeze passed through the village. Then a drip. Then two. Then a storm so gentle it felt like a lullaby. People ran outside, laughing, crying, dancing. But she stood still, eyes closed, and whispered, "Welcome back." The rain didn't come because she demanded. It came because her heart remembered what it felt like to receive before proof. And that feeling, that quiet, invisible knowing was the seed. The rest was just time catching up. The artist who drew what didn't exist until it did. He never sold a single painting. Not because his art lacked beauty, but because it was never meant to decorate walls. It was meant to unlock doors. He painted things that no one else could see, bridges that connected islands people had given up on, forests that grew inside cracked pavement, cities where joy walked freely and time waited for you to rest. When asked what he was painting, he always answered the same way. What isn't here yet, but will be. Some thought he was avoiding reality. Others called him a dreamer. But still, he painted. In a small room with peeling walls and leaky windows, he filled canvases with possibilities. He never rushed. He listened to colors. He argued with shadows. He waited for the silence to show him the next stroke. Outside, the world asked for proof. Inside, he offered presence. One day, a girl wandered into his studio, tears in her eyes. "I don't believe in anything anymore," she said. He handed her a brush and whispered, "Then let's paint something to believe in." She painted a house filled with warmth, and years later built it. A boy painted a school on a hill and grew up to teach where none existed before. A woman painted herself smiling and found joy again. No one knew if the paintings created the future or if they were echoes of something, waiting to be seen. All they knew was this: when you drew from the soul, the world found a way to answer. Eventually, his little studio became a place not of art, but of remembering. Remembering that the invisible isn't imaginary, it's simply early. And those who dare to draw it give others permission to believe again. He never sold a single painting, but somehow his walls were never empty. The little boy who collected smiles and hid them in his pockets, he was not the loudest child on the street, nor the quickest to win a race, but everyone remembered him. Maybe it was his quiet gaze that made people feel seen in ways they hadn't felt in years. Or maybe it was his habit of stopping mid-step to listen to things others ignored: the hum of a vending machine, the whisper of leaves brushing against a telephone wire, the sigh of an old door closing behind someone alone. His name was Jonah, though no one called him by it often. Most just said the boy, or that one who watches everything. He lived in a narrow house pressed between buildings, too tall for sunlight, with windows that faced nothing but shadows. His mother was always tired, his father always gone, and his shoes were always too small. But Jonah never complained. Instead, he wandered. Not far, just far enough. And he had a secret. He collected smiles, not drawings of them, not pictures, not anything that could be proven or shown, but real ones. The kind people gave when they thought no one was looking. A grandmother who smiled to herself after a phone call. A bus driver who chuckled when a child waved through the glass. A man in a suit who caught his reflection and, for a split second, liked what he saw. Jonah stored them. In his pockets, mostly. He'd pretend to pat down his pants as if searching for coins, when in fact he was tucking a smile away. He believed that if he carried enough of them, he might one day build something with them. He didn't know what, he just felt it. But the city didn't smile much anymore. People walked fast, heads down, ears blocked by wires and noise. They wore faces like armor, like if they showed softness, the world would steal something. Jonah noticed the change slowly, like fog creeping over the corners of a window. At first, his pockets were heavy with warmth. Then they became lighter, emptier, and soon he found himself tracing old routes where smiles used to live, only to find silence, cold faces, glass eyes. So he changed his mission. If he couldn't find smiles, he'd give them. Not the fake, kind people wear to be polite, but real ones. He practiced in the mirror, trying different kinds: wide ones, small ones, crooked ones. He learned which ones felt honest and which ones felt forced. Then he began to offer them to the mailman, to the woman at the fruit stand, to the man who swept the sidewalks with tired arms. Some ignored him, some looked confused, but some, just a few, smiled back. And when they did, Jonah would nod once, touch his pocket, and move on. Like a quiet ritual, a soft exchange, his pockets began to feel heavier again. Not with objects, but with something else. Something warmer than sunlight and quieter than rain. One evening, as the city lights blinked unlike weary eyes, Jonah sat on the front steps of his house and reached into his pocket. not to grab something, but to feel what was already there. And he thought, maybe smiles are like seeds. Maybe they grow when you give them away instead of hiding them. But he wasn't sure yet, so he decided to find out. He began to notice something he hadn't seen before. Not in the people, but in the spaces between them. In the air, around a person, just after they smiled, there was a shimmer. Not visible like light or shape, but present in feeling. Like a note at the end of a song you didn't realize was still echoing. He began to follow those echoes. He'd walk behind someone who had smiled sometimes 4 blocks, just to watch how their steps changed, softer, slower, as if something inside them had been loosened. It made him wonder, could a smile bend time? Could it fold the weight of a long day into something small and carryable? He never asked anyone. He didn't need to. His questions lived in silence, and that silence always answered in its own way. One afternoon, Jonah stood by the corner where 3 buses crossed. It was always loud there. People rushing, honking, phones ringing. A woman dropped a folder, and papers scattered like startled birds. No one stopped. But Jonah did. He gathered the pages quick, gentle, and handed them to her without a word. She looked down, startled. Her mouth was tight, eyes red. Then something cracked. A smile, tiny, exhausted, but real. He touched his pocket without thinking, and she noticed. "What did you just do?" she asked softly. He hesitated, then said, "Just keeping it safe." She didn't understand, but she didn't question either. And when she walked away, she looked back once. That night, Jonah wrote in his old notebook, the one he never showed anyone. He wrote, "Sometimes a smile doesn't fix the day. It just reminds you that the day isn't done yet." The next morning, he started something new. He began placing small folded notes in the places where people seemed the most tired. On bus seats, under park benches, between loaves of bread at the market. They weren't long, just simple sentences. "You've survived harder things than this. Someone is still grateful you exist. It's okay to rest. Even the sun does." He didn't sign them. He didn't wait around to see who found them. He just kept walking, one note lighter, one pocket emptier, one heart fuller. Weeks passed. The city didn't change overnight, but Jonah noticed things. A man who always frowned now nodded at strangers. A woman who never looked up now fed birds during lunch. A tired father at the corner shop began humming softly as he worked. The smiles he once collected were now growing without his help. Not everywhere, not all at once, but enough to know something invisible was working. One evening, while walking home, Jonah saw a small note folded and tucked into the crack of a wall. It wasn't his handwriting. It read, "Your quiet matters, more than you know." He stood there a long time, longer than he needed to. Then he smiled, not the kind you give, but the kind that gives back. And for the first time, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, some of the smiles he planted had started planting others. One morning, Jonah woke up to find something taped to the front door. A small envelope, plain, no name. Inside, a square piece of paper with 7 hand-drawn smiley faces, all different. Underneath them, a message written in careful pencil. "I think you dropped these." No one in his family mentioned it. They rarely noticed the small things he noticed. But Jonah stared at the note for a long time before placing it carefully inside the same box where he kept feathers, bottle caps, and moments he didn't want to forget. That week, the air around the city felt different, softer, not quieter, but less sharp, like someone had turned down the volume of worry. And Jonah began to feel something he hadn't expected. Not joy, not even pride, but companionship. A sense that somewhere out there, someone else was watching the world the way he did. He started noticing things that looked like echoes of his own actions. A chalk drawing on the sidewalk that read, "You are someone's favorite. Hello?" A cup of warm tea left on a cold bench beside a sleeping man. A girl tying tiny ribbons to a street lamp, each one with a word like hope or safe or brave. He didn't know who was behind it. He didn't try to find out, but he felt the warmth of it, like light coming through a window you forgot you had. One afternoon, he placed a folded note inside the mailbox of an apartment building where people never smiled. As he turned to leave, a boy about his age stepped out. He had paint on his fingers and sadness in his eyes. "Did you leave that?" he asked. Jonah paused, then nodded. The boy didn't smile, but he didn't frown either. "Cool," he said, "okay," and walked away. The next day, Jonah found a painted stone outside his front door. A smiley face. No words. Just that. They never spoke again. But more stones appeared in random places. On top of a hydrant. On a bench. Once even tucked in his backpack without him noticing. Each time, it felt like a conversation, quiet, wordless, and full. Jonah began to understand that what he was building wasn't just a habit or a hope. It was a network, an invisible thread. Like veins beneath the city, carrying something vital through unnoticed paths. He started to believe that maybe others were doing the same. That maybe people just needed a small, one quiet example to remember how to be kind again. One evening, while watching the sunset from a rooftop, Jonah whispered into the wind, "I don't need to be the only one. I just want to be one of them." And somehow, that wish didn't feel like a request. It felt like a recognition. Like he had already become part of something bigger than himself. Not by leading it, but by lighting it, one soft moment at a time. It began with a scrap of paper left on the seat of a bus. Jonah hadn't planned to ride that day, but a sudden pull in his chest told him to go. He boarded without thinking, sat in the middle row, and there it was, folded twice, faded, waiting. No name, no decoration, just a single drawing in blue ink, a circle with 4 arrows pointing outward, and a dot in the middle. Nothing else. Jonah stared at it the whole ride. It wasn't a smile. It wasn't a note. It was a map, but of what, he couldn't tell. That night, he spread it on his desk and traced the lines again and again. Something about it felt familiar. Not the shape, but the feeling. Like a whisper from a forgotten part of him. The next morning, he walked through the city, following his intuition, not the lines. He turned when he felt stillness. He paused where the air softened, and slowly he found them 4 spots spread across blocks, quiet and unspectacular. Cracked step behind the library, a crooked tree at the edge of a parking lot, a mural missing half its color, a drained cover with a single yellow ribbon tied to it. At each place, he waited, not for someone, but for something. And in each spot, he left something small, a stone, a note, a folded paper heart. When he reached the fourth place, the ribbon, he hesitated. Something in his chest felt tight, like a breath held too long. He sat down beside it and closed his eyes. Minutes passed. Then footsteps, light, careful. When he opened his eyes, a girl about his age stood there. She didn't speak, just nodded, then sat beside him. In her hand, a folded drawing. Okay. She handed it to him. It was the same map, but with one addition: the word together, written beneath the center. They didn't exchange names. They didn't need to. They just sat, listening to the hum of the city, the soft song of wind between buildings, the sound of something ancient remembering how to bloom. Over the next few weeks, Jonah noticed more marks, not just from her, but from others too. Chalk circles, tied strings, quiet markers of invisible work being done. The city hadn't changed, but the way it breathed had. It exhaled more gently. Now, as if the collective acts of quiet kindness had begun weaving something larger beneath the surface, and Jonah, once alone in his mission, now felt part of an orchestra of silent givers. They didn't wear badges. They didn't share plans. They just gave. One smile, one note, one small act at a time. And for the first time, Jonah realized he no longer needed to keep the smiles in his pocket, because they were everywhere now, blooming in cracks, floating through windows, reflected in eyes that used to look away. That night, as he lay in bed, with his hand resting over his chest, he whispered, "Maybe the world isn't broken. Maybe it's just waiting to be remembered." It happened on the kind of morning most people forget. No celebration, no special air, just light rain tapping gently against rooftops and the soft gray of clouds resting low over the city. Jonah had grown not much in height, but in stillness. His presence felt like the pause between notes, the breath before truth. He no longer roamed the streets looking for smiles. He no longer filled his pockets. He had learned that some seeds don't need to be carried. They only need to be planted, and they will find their way back. That morning, something tugged gently at him again, the same way it did the day he boarded the wrong bus and found a message waiting. He followed it. No destination, just trust. The streets felt familiar but different, softer. The walls seemed to hold less tension. The sidewalks carried more laughter in their cracks. As he turned a corner, he saw them. Not one or two, but many. Children, teens, even adults. Leaving? Notes. Drawing circles. Passing folded papers into empty hands. One child placed a painted rock on a bench and skipped away without looking back. Another left a candle beneath a tree. A woman paused to smile at a stranger smiled. First, Jonah didn't cry. He just watched, heart wide, hands still. And in that moment, he felt a return, not in applause or praise, not in thanks, but an echo, the deep, invisible echo that vibrated through his ribs like music played only for him. He walked slowly to the center of the square, where someone had left a wooden box. It had no lock, no name, only a message carved softly on the lid. For the one who remembered. He opened it. Inside, hundreds of folded notes. Some his own, some unfamiliar, all written by hearts that had been touched, then decided to touch others. He didn't need to read them. He already knew what they said. because he had lived every one of them. That night, back home, Jonah didn't place anything in his pockets. He didn't need to. Instead, he opened his window, looked out into the quiet, dark, and whispered, "Thank you for returning what I gave without expecting." And somewhere far, or maybe just inside him, something answered. It was never gone. You just had to stop looking long enough to feel it return. He laid down, eyes closed, heart full. And for the first time, he dreamed not of collecting, but of releasing, of giving what he no longer needed to hold, of walking through a world that smiled. First, not because it had changed, but because he had. The girl who worked at the market and became its owner without ever raising her voice, she arrived before the sun did. Always did. Long before the city opened its eyes, before the trucks rolled in, before the first tomato was laid out in neat pyramids of color. She was there, pulling up the metal gate, sweeping yesterday's dust, laying out crates of onions like they were gold coins. Her name was Isadora, but at the market, they just called her Isa. She didn't mind. Names didn't mean much in a place where everything moved fast, loud, and heavy. Voices shouted, prices clashed, and hands moved like birds quick, sharp, always trading something. Isa, however, was different. She didn't shout. She didn't bark prices or wave her arms like flags. She worked like water, quiet, constant, shaping everything around her without anyone noticing. Her stall wasn't the biggest. Her produce wasn't always the cheapest, but somehow people kept coming back. Maybe it was the way she arranged the fruit, never just stacked, but placed like something sacred. Maybe it was how she remembered each customer's name, even when they forgot hers. Or maybe it was something deeper, something she carried that no one could quite name. A stillness in the chaos, a certainty behind the silence. What most didn't know was that Isa didn't want to run a stall. Not forever. She wanted more. Not out of greed, but out of vision. She had seen what the market could be if someone truly cared. Not just about profit, but about people, about the energy, the experience, the soul of it. But she didn't say it out loud. Not yet. She just listened, watched, learned. Every stall taught her something. The way the butcher wrapped the meat said something about respect. The way the flower seller sang to her roses said something about love. The way one vendor argued with his customers told her what not to do. Isa took mental notes, then wrote them down later in a notebook she never showed anyone. The woman with the green eyes only buys when the tomatoes shine. The man in the blue hat is lonely. He talks more than he shops. Noise gets attention. Calm builds trust. She didn't go to business school. She went to work every single day. And slowly, her mind began building something bigger than a stall, a structure, a system, a quiet revolution. But it began inside, not in the money drawer, not in the fruit crates, in her, Akana. She started changing how she spoke to herself. No more, I'm just helping out. No more, this isn't mine. Instead, she whispered thoughts like prayers between each transaction. I am learning how to lead. I see what others don't. This space will remember me. No one noticed, but the market felt it. Like a subtle breeze in a room that's been still too long. She didn't need to announce herself. The ground shifted anyway. And deep inside, Isa knew she wasn't just working here. She was becoming it. The market never slowed down, but Isa did. Not out of laziness or lack of ambition, but because she knew something the others didn't. Growth didn't always come from speed. Sometimes it came from observation. While others shouted over each other, Isa listened. Not just to people, but to rhythm. She noticed how foot traffic changed with the weather, how certain corners stayed empty, how the woman who sold herbs always had more customers when she moved her cart 2 feet to the left. Isa took notes, not for now, but for later. Every observation became a seed she tucked away, watered with attention. And over time, something began to bloom, not outside, but within. She stopped comparing herself to others. She stopped chasing. She started aligning. If I'm meant to build something bigger, she whispered one morning, then I don't need to root, I need to root. Her energy changed, and because it did, so did her results. Customers lingered longer at her stall. Some asked her for advice on prices, supply, even strategy. She answered softly but clearly, always with a tone that didn't try to dominate, but somehow still directed. Word began to spread quietly. Isa knows things. Isa listens. Isa never needs to yell, but you hear her anyway. Other vendors started to ask her opinion on layout, on pricing, on what to order next season. She didn't give commands. She asked questions. What's working for you right now? What if you tried a different color for your canopy? Have you noticed the traffic shifts near noon? Her value wasn't loud, was useful, and that kind of value doesn't stay hidden for long. One day, the market's coordinator approached her. He was older, tired, and thinking of stepping back. You ever thought of doing more than just running your stall? He asked. Isa didn't smile. She just said, I've been thinking of everything. He laughed, handed her a clipboard, and said, start small. Help me organize the weekend. Schedule. Let's see what else you know. That night, she didn't sleep. Not from anxiety, but from readiness. The kind that buzzes when a door opens that your heart had been quietly knocking on for years. She opened her old notebook, flipped past pages filled with notes, and began writing in a new section. Title: Leadership Without Noise. She wrote until the candle burned low. I don't need power. I need perspective. Influence is energy, not volume. What you manage outside reflects what you organize inside. Isa was no longer working for a stall. She was working through one. It was no longer about selling vegetables. It was about building a market she would be proud to walk through, even if it didn't have her name on the gate. But deep down, she knew one day it didn't happen all at once. The market didn't transform overnight, but small things began to shift. Things only someone like Isa would notice. Trash bins stayed cleaner. Conflicts between vendors grew shorter. Some began to use her layout suggestions. The woman who once rolled her eyes at Isa's silence now greeted her each morning with a nod that said, "Thank you for how you made this easier." Isa never claimed credit. She didn't need to. Her reward wasn't attention, it was alignment. The coordinator gave her more responsibilities, slowly, without ceremony. First, it was the stall map. Then, it was negotiating with new suppliers. Eventually, she was asked to organize a weekend fair, a special event the market had tried to run before but never succeeded. She accepted. Not with loud excitement, but with the same quiet certainty she brought to everything else. She walked the aisles with a measuring tape, noted shade patterns during different hours of the day, asked each vendor what they would need, not just what they wanted to sell. She didn't try to impress. She tried to understand. The event, when it came, wasn't flashy, but it flowed. Music played gently in the background. Children found their way to a corner with painted rocks and crayons. Elderly customers had chairs to rest on between stalls. Even the usually loud vendors found themselves speaking softer, almost matching the energy Isa had woven through the space. By the end of the day, the market had made more money than any weekend that year. But that wasn't the point. The point was, it felt different, like something alive. Isa stood at the edge of it all, arms crossed, not out of doubt but of peace. She had no uniform, no title, but everyone knew she had built something, not by taking control, but by holding space. One of the elder vendors came up to her, smiled, and said, "You didn't build a market, girl. You built a feeling. We all just sell inside it now." Isa thanked him and wrote that down later. The space you create speaks louder than your voice. That week, the coordinator, tired, ready to retire, called a meeting. "I'm stepping down," he said, "and we need someone to carry the soul of this place forward. Not just the schedule, the soul." The room was quiet. Then someone said it, then another, then a third. Isa. She didn't rush to answer. She didn't cry. She just looked at her hands, the same ones that had stacked tomatoes and swept aisles, and thought, "They've always been building this. I just didn't know yet." She stood, nodded once, and said, "If I lead, we lead together." And everyone clapped, not loudly, but fully. She didn't change everything right away. Isa knew that real transformation didn't come from flipping switches, it came from lighting one candle at a time. Her first act as coordinator wasn't to rewrite the rules. It was to walk the market differently, not as someone supervising, but as someone attuning. She paid attention to energy. Where did it flow easily? Where did it get stuck? What did the vendors avoid talking about? Where did the customers stop? And where did they rush? She listened without interrupting, observed without correcting, and only after weeks of watching did she begin to move the pieces. First, she asked the older vendors what they needed to feel safe. Then she asked the younger ones what they needed to grow. Then she did something that surprised everyone. She created a rest area. Just a shaded corner with water, a fan, and 2 chairs. For the workers, she said. So we don't forget we're human too. It didn't cost much, but it shifted everything. People slowed down, talked more, argued less. Isa began creating systems that matched her own energy, calm, clear, efficient. She posted a weekly letter at the entrance. Not a bulletin, a letter. With the reflections, reminders, a thought. For the week, this place holds your effort. Let's make it hold your pride, too. Prosperity isn't loud. It's consistent. What we tend to, with love, grows stronger roots. Customers started reading them, then asking who wrote them, and thanking her. One even offered to help translate them into other languages so more people could feel included. Isa said, yes, always yes, to help that came with heart. She no longer had a stall of her own, but in a way, the whole market had become hers. my ownership, but by care. She planted herbs along the back fence, invited local musicians to play soft melodies in the mornings, added hand-painted signs to help elders and newcomers navigate. None of it screamed for attention, but all of it whispered, "Someone thought of you." And that, Isa believed, was what made a space feel like wealth. Not glitter, but gentleness. Not scale, but soul. Some questioned her decisions. Why waste time on things that don't increase profit? She answered simply, because I'm not building profit. I'm building permanence. At night, she walked the aisles after everyone left. She touched the wooden tables, the cool pipes, the canvas tents. She whispered to them, "You are not just a market. You are a memory people carry home." And when she got home, she wrote in her newest notebook, under a heading called Legacy, "Quiet things last longer. The market is finally breathing with me." Years passed, but Isa didn't change much. Her voice remained soft. Her hands still moved slowly, but everything around her had transformed. The market was now a place where people came not just to be but to belong. New vendors arrived with light in their eyes. Old vendors stayed longer than they'd planned. Children who once ran barefoot now helped stack fruit after school, watching how Isa greeted each morning like it was sacred. She had become more than a coordinator. She had become a root. And because of her, the market no longer grew outward, grew downward, deeper, like something built to last beyond anyone's name. Isa never asked for recognition. But one afternoon, a girl arrived. Young, quiet, maybe 15. She stood in front of Isa with a notebook in her hand and eyes full of hesitation. "Can I talk to you?" she asked. Isa nodded. They sat near the herb garden under the new shade cloth that Isa had sewn herself. The girl opened her notebook and read a list of ideas, small ways to make the market even more welcoming. Braille menus, a quiet hour for people with sensory needs, a corner for free books. Isa didn't interrupt. She just listened. And when the girl finished, she looked down, suddenly unsure. "Sorry," she whispered. "I know I talk too soft." "That's what people say." Isa smiled. "So do I," she said. "And look what we built with it." The girl smiled back wide, full, like she hadn't done in a long time. Isa gave her the notebook. "Start writing your own section," she said. "This place will need your voice next." That night, Isa sat alone in the market, as she often did, watching the empty stalls and the way the wind played with the corners of the tarps. She didn't feel important. She felt present, which, to her, was better. She whispered her final thought for the day into the stillness, like she always did. "They said you have to shout to be heard, but maybe you just have to mean it." And with that, she closed her eyes, letting the quiet do what it always had, carry her further than noise ever could. The vendor who repeated 3 words before opening his stall. He had a stall at the edge of the square, where the shadows of tall buildings met the first touch of morning light. It wasn't the biggest stall, nor the brightest, but it had something that made people stop even when they weren't sure why. The vendor's name was Nilo. Most didn't know it. They just called him the quiet one or the early man. He sold simple things: handmade soaps, candles, cloth pouches filled with dried herbs. Nothing screamed, nothing glittered, but everything felt charged, alive, and maybe that was because of the 3 words. Every morning, before untying the tarp, before lifting a single crate, before even sipping the tea, he brought in a thermos wrapped with string. Nilo would place his hand gently on the front of the stall, close, his eyes, and whispered the same 3 words. It already is. He didn't say them out loud, not for attention. They weren't a slogan. They were a signal to something deeper, something older than commerce and louder than doubt. A signal to the part of him that used to wait for proof before believing. He no longer waited. He began with belief. It already is. He didn't explain the phrase to anyone, not even to himself. It wasn't a strategy. It was a remembering. A reminder that he wasn't building a dream. He was revealing it. One sale at a time. One conversation at a time. One breath at a time. Most days were quiet, but never empty. People came slowly, like leaves drawn by wind. Some bought, some didn't, but almost all lingered. They'd touch a bar of soap and ask, "Did you make this yourself?" Or run fingers across the embroidered cloth and say, "It smells like something I forgot." Nilo always answered with the same kind of softness, as if he wasn't trying to sell, just share. And that was part of it. He wasn't there to hustle. He was there to hold space, not just on the sidewalk, but in the air around people who didn't know they needed a pause. His income wasn't predictable, but his energy was. And over time, something happened. People started returning not for the products, but for the experience, for the energy, for the stall that felt like a pocket of peace in the middle of the city's hunger. One morning, a boy asked him, "Why do you smile before anyone shows up?" Nilo looked down gently and said, "Because it already is." The boy blinked. "What is?" Nilo just smiled again. Not to be mysterious, but because the answer wasn't meant to be explained, only felt, and perhaps that was why it worked. Not because he believed success was coming, but because, in his mind, it had already arrived. The rest was just catching up. Not long after, a woman approached his stall with hesitation in her step and a question she didn't yet know how to ask. She touched a lavender pouch gently, held it to her nose, and exhaled as if she'd finally remembered the feeling of calm. "Do you take special requests?" she asked. Nilo nodded, as he always did, without urgency. She explained that her sister had passed months earlier, and the house still smelled heavy. "It's not about the scent," she whispered. "It's about the weight." Nilo didn't reach for a product. He reached for understanding. He asked 2 questions. What memories did the house carry? And what kind of air did she want to breathe now? Her answers weren't poetic, but they were honest. And from them, he created something new, a blend of clove and pine with a drop of sweet orange and rosemary. She held the bottle like it was more than oil. It was, because he had listened not to her words, but to what rested beneath them. She left quietly, but 3 days later, another woman came. "You made something for my neighbor," she said. And she told me just being in her home feels different now. Word had started to travel not through signs or campaigns, but through sensation. People couldn't describe what Nilo's stall gave them, so they said things like, "It feels like exhaling," or "I didn't know I needed this until I stood here." He never asked how they found him, he just whispered. His 3 words each morning, trusting that alignment speaks louder than marketing. It already is. And because he believed that, people began to treat his space as something more than a place to buy. One woman came to cry. One man came to sit in silence. A teenage girl asked if she could sketch while standing nearby. He said yes, always yes. His stall became something between a shop and a sanctuary. And the more he let go of trying to control its growth, the more it expanded organically, quietly, faithfully. Still, there were hard days, storms, long hours with no sales, moments when doubt tapped on the back of his mind like rain against old glass. But each time, he returned to the ritual. 3 words, 1 breath, 1 presence. It already is. And with those words, he remembered, it was never about how much he made in a day. It was about how deeply he stood in the frequency of what he believed he was building. And because he stood there long enough, the world began to meet him there. 2. It was a Thursday when a stranger stood near his stall longer than usual. He didn't touch anything. He didn't speak. Just stood there, hands behind his back, watching the slow rhythm of Nilo folding a cloth, lighting incense, adjusting the corners of his space like someone preparing a sacred table. After a while, the man said, "Do you always do it this way? Even when no one's here?" Nilo looked up, smiled, and replied, "Especially when no one's here." The man said nothing for a moment, then pulled out a card and handed it to Nilo. "I run the wellness center outside the city. We host retreats. Think you're offering something we've forgotten how to value." He didn't elaborate. Just said, "Come visit, if you're open," and left. Nilo didn't chase the invitation. He placed the card in his notebook, whispered his 3 words the next morning, and kept showing up to his stall like always. Weeks passed. Then one morning, after repeating it already is, Nilo felt the stillness stretch longer than usual. A soft nudge, not urgency, but clarity. He closed his stall early, packed with care, and traveled to the address on the card. The center was small, tucked between trees, surrounded by silence, so full it echoed. The man was there, waiting. He showed Nilo the space and outdoor deck used for yoga and breathwork. "Could you bring your stall here for a day? Just once. No pressure to sell. Just be." Nilo agreed. That weekend, he set up under the trees. Same cloth, same arrangement, same 3 words before beginning. But this time, something shifted. People sat beside his table without needing to speak. They picked up a candle, then put it back, their eyes filled with softness. One woman said, "I didn't buy anything, but I feel like I received something." That evening, the retreat host asked if Nilo would come back monthly, then bi-weekly. Eventually, they offered him a small, covered space to build something permanent there. "Your presence changes the air," they said. "You don't just bring products, you bring pause." Nilo didn't see himself as special, but he understood one thing. He had stopped waiting for the world to confirm his value. And because he treated every small action like it already carried meaning, it began to. He kept his original stall in the city. It still mattered to him, but now he had 2 places where his silence worked. 2 spaces where energy greeted him first. His income stabilized. Not through hustle, but through gravity. People came without being pulled. And as he laid out his soaps, his oils, his pouches of intention, he no longer hoped they'd be received. He knew they already were. The rest was just timing. The requests began as whispers. One person asked if Nilo taught what he did. Another wondered if he had ever considered writing something. A third said, "Whatever this is, it feels like more than a stall." Nilo listened, but didn't rush. He didn't believe in branding stillness. He didn't want to turn presence into product. But he knew what they meant. Something inside him had changed, and the change was visible, felt, carried, not in his voice, but in his way. One day, a woman brought her teenage son to meet him. "He doesn't speak much," she said, "but he notices everything." Boy stood quietly, eyes wide, touching the folds of the cloth, the texture of the soap. Nilo didn't speak either. He simply pulled out a blank pouch and offered the boy a pen. "Write a word that you want to carry with you," he said. The boy wrote, "Enough." Nilo nodded. "That's the most powerful word of all." From that day, Nilo added a small wooden box to his stall. Inside, blank slips of paper and a pen. Above it, a sign that said, "Leave a word." Take a breath. People began writing, not wishes, just reminders. Words like peace, belonging, flow, bravery, rest. Sometimes he'd read them at the end of the day, as if studying the silent vocabulary of those who passed through. One evening, a soft-spoken therapist who often visited the retreat center approached him. "I think you're doing something close to healing," she said. "Have you ever thought of guiding others into this space?" Nilo shook his head. "I'm not a teacher," she smiled. "You don't need to teach, just invite." And that sentence stayed. Just invite. A few weeks later, he hosted a circle. Small, no chairs, just mats under a canopy of leaves. He didn't give a speech. He simply shared his ritual, showed them how he opened his day, how he chose silence before strategy, how he said the 3 words, "It already is." Then he invited them to choose their own 3, not to copy, but to discover what phrase could guide you through the noise. He asked. Some cried, some wrote, all listened, and as the group ended, someone whispered, "This is the first time I felt calm without needing to understand why." Nilo didn't plan another circle, but they asked, so he continued. Monthly, then weekly, the stall remained, the products remained. But now, the space between the items carried even more, not things, but truth. His prosperity had multiplied not in scale, but in substance, not in how much he had, but in how much he held. And all of it traced back to one quiet vow, one breath, 3 words, and a choice to live as if the future had already arrived, waiting only for his attention. The seasons turned gently, like pages of a book written in soft ink. The city moved on, as cities do always, faster than necessary. But Nilo's stall remained, not frozen in time, but anchored, a still point in a spinning world. People came and went. Some brought their children. Some brought their elders. Some came not to buy, but just to stand. And no matter what the day held, Nilo always began the same way. He opened his hands, touched the wood, closed his eyes, and whispered, "It already is," not out of habit, but because the meaning only grew deeper. One morning, as the sky held a pale gold, a woman approached with a canvas in her arms. She was young, quiet, and familiar. "You don't remember me," she said, "but years ago, I wrote a word at your stall." Nilo smiled. He didn't need to remember faces. he remembered energies. The word was permission, she said. That day, something shifted in me. I started painting again. This, she held up the canvas, is for you. It was abstract, but unmistakably felt, like breath turned into color, like stillness on cloth. He accepted it without a word, hung it gently behind his table. And from that day forward, it became part of the ritual. People asked what it meant. He always said the same thing. It means something's working. He never became famous. He was never interviewed. He never opened more stalls, built an empire, or chased scale. But people whispered his name in places he'd never been. There's a man in the city who sells calm. He doesn't sell products, he sells reminders. You leave lighter than you arrived. In the final years of his life, Nilo taught a handful of people, not through curriculum, but by example. He called them guardians of quiet things. Some opened stalls of their own. Some became therapists. Some just raised children who knew how to breathe deeply. When Nilo passed, it wasn't on the front page. But the square felt different. That morning, lighter, slower. Someone lit a candle where his stall once stood. Another left a pouch with the word, Great Tao. A child drew 3 circles in chalk on the sidewalk. No one needed to explain. They all understood. And if you walk through that square today, you might find a vendor who opens their stall with silence, or someone who begins each day with 3 words that only they can hear, not because Nilo told them to, but because he showed them what happens when you choose to believe, even before there's proof, especially before there's proof, because truth, when lived long enough, begins to echo, and that echo is prosperity. The vendor who repeated 3 words before opening his stall, he had a stall at the edge of the square where the shadows of tall buildings met the first touch of morning light. It wasn't the biggest stall, nor the brightest, but it had something that made people stop even when they weren't sure why. The vendor's name was Nilo. Most didn't know it. They just called him the Quiet One or the Early Man. He sold simple things, handmade soaps, candles, cloth pouches filled with dried herbs. Nothing screamed, nothing glittered, but everything felt, charged, alive, and maybe that was because of the 3 words. Every morning, before untying the tarp, before lifting a single crate, before even sipping the tea, he brought in a thermos wrapped with string. Nilo would place his hand gently on the front of the stall, close, his eyes, and whisper the same 3 words. It already is. He didn't say them out loud, not for attention. They weren't a slogan. They were a signal to something deeper, something older than commerce and louder than doubt. A signal to the part of him that used to wait for proof before believing. He no longer waited. He began with belief. It already is. He didn't explain the phrase to anyone, not even to himself. It wasn't a strategy. It was a remembering. A reminder that he wasn't building a dream. He was revealing it. One sale at a time. One conversation at a time. One breath at a time. Most days were quiet, but never empty. People came slowly, like leaves drawn by wind. Some bought, some didn't, but almost all lingered. They'd touch a bar of soap and ask, "Did you make this yourself?" Or run fingers across the embroidered cloth and say, "It smells like something I forgot." Nilo always answered with the same kind of softness, as if he wasn't trying to sell, just share. And that was part of it. He wasn't there to hustle. He was there to hold space. Not just on the sidewalk, but in the air, around people who didn't know they needed a pause. His income wasn't predictable, but his energy was. And over time, something happened. People started returning not for the products, but for the experience, for the energy, for the stall that felt like a pocket of peace in the middle of the city's hunger. One morning, a boy asked him, "Why do you smile before anyone shows up?" Nilo looked down, gently, and said, "Because it already is." The boy blinked. "What is?" Nilo just smiled again. Not to be mysterious, but because the answer wasn't meant to be explained, it's only felt. And perhaps that was why it worked. Not because he believed success was coming, but because, in his mind, it had already arrived. The rest was just catching up. Not long after, a woman approached his stall with hesitation in her step and a question she didn't yet know how to ask. She touched a lavender pouch gently, held it to her nose, and exhaled as if she'd finally remembered the feeling of calm. "Do you take special requests?" she asked. Nilo nodded, as he always did without urgency. She explained that her sister had passed months earlier and the house still smelled heavy. "It's not about the scent," she whispered. "It's about the weight." Nilo didn't reach for a product. He reached for understanding. He asked 2 questions. What memories did the house carry? And what kind of air did she want to breathe now? Her answers weren't poetic, but they were honest. And from them, he created something new, a blend of clove and pine, with a drop of sweet orange and rosemary. She held the bottle like it was more than oil. It was, because he had listened not to her words, but to what rested beneath them. She left quietly, but 3 days later, another woman came. "You made something for my neighbor," she said. And she told me just being in her home feels different now. Word had started to travel not through signs or campaigns, but through sensation. People couldn't describe what Nilo's stall gave them. So they said things like, "It feels like exhaling," or "I didn't know I needed this until I stood here." He never asked how they found him. He just whispered his 3 words each morning, trusting that alignment speaks louder than marketing. It already is. And because he believed that, people began to treat his space as something more than a place to buy. One woman came to cry. One man came to sit in silence. A teenage girl asked if she could sketch while standing nearby. Said yes, always yes. His stall became something between a shop and a sanctuary. And the more he let go of trying to control its growth, the more it expanded, organically, quietly, faithfully. Still, there were hard days, storms, long hours with no sales, moments when doubt tapped on the back of his mind like rain against old glass. But each time, he returned to the ritual. 3 words, 1 breath, 1 presence, it already is. And with those words, he remembered. It was never about how much he made in a day. It was about how deeply he stood in the frequency of what he believed he was building. And because he stood there long enough, the world began to meet him there. Till it was a Thursday when a stranger stood near his stall longer than usual. He didn't touch anything. He didn't speak. Just stood there, hands behind his back, watching the slow rhythm of Nilo folding a cloth, lighting incense, adjusting the corners of his space like someone preparing a sacred table. After a while, the man said, "Do you always do it this way?" even when no one's here. Neela looked up, smiled, and replied, especially when no one's here. The man said nothing for a moment, then pulled out a card and handed it to Neela. I run a wellness center outside the city. We host retreats. I think you're offering something we've forgotten how to value. He didn't elaborate, just said, come visit, if you're open, and left. Nilo didn't chase the invitation. He placed the card in his notebook, whispered his 3 words the next morning, and kept showing up to his stall like always. Weeks passed. Then one morning, after repeating it already is, Nilo felt the stillness stretch longer than usual. A soft nudge, not urgency, but clarity. He closed his stall early, packed with care, and traveled to the address on the card. The center was small, tucked between trees, surrounded by silence so full it echoed. The man was there, waiting. Showed Nilo the space and outdoor deck used for yoga and breath work. Could you bring your stall here for a day? Just once, no pressure to sell. Just be. Nilo agreed. That weekend, he set up under the trees. Same cloth, same arrangement, same 3 words before beginning. But this time, something shifted. People sat beside his table without needing to speak. They picked up a candle, then put it back, their eyes filled with softness. One woman said, I didn't buy anything, but I feel like I received something. That evening, the retreat host asked if Nilo would come back monthly, then bi-weekly. Eventually, they offered him a small covered space to build something permanent there. Your presence changes the air, they said. You don't just bring products, you bring pause. Nilo didn't see himself as special, but he understood one thing. He had stopped waiting for the world to confirm his value. And because he treated every small action like it already carried meaning, it began to. He kept his original stall in the city. It still mattered to him. But now, he had 2 places where his silence worked. 2 spaces where energy greeted him first. His income stabilized, not through hustle, but through gravity. People came without being pulled. And as he laid out his soaps, his oils, his pouches of intention, he no longer hoped they'd be received. He knew they already were. The rest was just timing. The requests began as whispers. One person asked if Nilo taught what he did. Another wondered if he had ever considered writing something. A third said, whatever this is, it feels like more than a stall. Nilo listened, but didn't rush. He didn't believe in branding stillness. He didn't want to turn presence into product. But he knew what they meant. Something inside him had changed, and the change was visible, felt, carried, not in his voice, but in his way. One day, a woman brought her teenage son to meet him. He doesn't speak much, she said, but he notices everything. Boy stood quietly, eyes wide, touching the folds of the cloth, the texture of the soap. Nilo didn't speak either. He simply pulled out a blank pouch and offered the boy a pen. Write a word that you want to carry with you, he said. The boy wrote, enough. Nilo nodded. That's the most powerful word of all. From that day, Nilo added a small wooden box to his stall. Inside, blank slips of paper and a pen. Above it, a sign that said, leave a word. Take a breath. People began writing, not wishes, just reminders. Words like peace, belonging, flow, bravery, rest. Sometimes he'd read them at the end of the day, as if studying the silent vocabulary of those who pass through. One evening, a soft-spoken therapist who often visited the retreat center approached him. "I think you're doing something close to healing," she said. "Have you ever thought of guiding others into this space?" Nilo shook his head. "I'm not a teacher," she smiled. "You don't need to teach, just invite." And that sentence stayed. Just invite. A few weeks later, he hosted a circle. Small, no chairs, just mats under a canopy of leaves. He didn't give a speech. He simply shared his ritual, showed them how he opened his day, how he chose silence before strategy, how he said the 3 words, "It already is." Then he invited them to choose their own 3, not to copy, but to discover what phrase could guide you through the noise. He asked. Some cried, some wrote, all listened. And as the group ended, someone whispered, "This is the first time I felt calm without needing to understand why." Nilo didn't plan another circle, but they asked. He continued. Monthly, then weekly. The stall remained. The products remained. But now, the space between the items carried even more. Not things, but truth. His prosperity had multiplied not in scale, but in substance, not in how much he had, but in how much he held. And all of it traced back to one quiet vow, one breath, 3 words, and a choice to live as if the future had already arrived, waiting only for his attention. The seasons turned gently, like pages of a book written in soft ink. The city moved on, as cities do, always faster than necessary. But Nilo's stall remained. Not frozen in time, but anchored, still point in a spinning world. People came and went. Some brought their children. Some brought their elders. Some came not to buy, but just to stand. And no matter what the day held, Nilo always began the same way. He opened his hands, touched the wood, closed his eyes, and whispered, "It already is," not out of habit, but because the meaning only grew deeper. One morning, as the sky held a pale gold, a woman approached with a canvas in her arms. She was young, quiet, and familiar. "You don't remember me," she said, "but years ago I wrote a word at your stall." Nilo smiled. He didn't need to remember faces. He remembered energies. "The word was permission," she said. "That day, something shifted in me. I started painting again. This," she held up the canvas, "is for you." It was abstract, but unmistakably felt, like breath turned into color, like stillness on cloth. He accepted it without a word, hung it gently behind his table. And from that day forward, it became part of the ritual. People asked what it meant. He always said the same thing. "It means something's working." He never became famous. He was never interviewed. He never opened more stalls, built an empire, or chased scale. But people whispered his name in places he'd never been. "There's a man in the city who sells calm." He doesn't sell products, he sells reminders. You leave lighter than you arrived. In the final years of his life, Nilo taught a handful of people, not through curriculum, but by example. He called them guardians of quiet things. Some opened stalls of their own. Some became therapists. Some just raised children who knew how to breathe deeply. When Nilo passed, it wasn't on the front page. But the square felt different. That morning, lighter, slower. Someone lit a candle where his stall once stood. Another left a pouch with the word great a Tao. A child drew 3 circles in chalk on the sidewalk. No one needed to explain. They all understood. And if you walk through that square today, you might find a vendor who opens their stall with silence, or someone who begins each day with 3 words that only they can hear, not because Nilo told them to, but because he showed them what happens when you choose to believe, even before there's proof. Especially before there's proof. Because truth, when lived long enough, begins to echo, and that echo is prosperity.